So welcome everybody. So excited to have you here today. I'm Katie Kapler, and I'm going to be moderating this awesome panel we have today, which is talking about kind of the intersection of artificial intelligence and human connection and sense of belonging, specifically in the learning community and in higher education. So I have some great panelists who are going to introduce themselves in just 1 second. But before that, a couple of logistics. So first of all, I am joined today by my colleague, Danielle Bonner. She is going to keep us on track. And if you have questions, we really encourage you to put them into the chat so everyone can see them. Danielle will be kind of monitoring there and make sure that we pull in anything that comes through. I mentioned this earlier, the chat's live, but when you go into post, it's going to default you just to posting to the panelists. So all the other webinar participants won't see it. So you just change that in the drop down to everyone and post, and then all of your fellow attendees will be able to see what you say as well. We're also going to have some interaction in this presentation. So if you want to get out your device or open up a browser tab and go to slido.com and enter this number right here, as we go through, a couple of polls will pop up, and we'd love to have you participate there as well. If you don't get that number right now, I think Danielle's going to drop a link to the Slido in the chat, and then it'll show up again. I think maybe even on the next slide. So I'll leave that up while I also say we are recording this webinar, and we'll send it out afterwards. So if you want to revisit anything, I know that the panelists are going to talk about a lot of stuff that's going on and probably a lot of things that they've been reading. We'll do our best to gather up those links and share them afterward, if we can keep track of all those along the way. Okay, so everyone's already doing this. I don't even know if we need to do this anymore in Zoom. Please introduce yourself. We'd love to know who you are, what brought you here today, where you're from. We have a great big group today, so I think we've got probably people coming in at least from all over the US, if not from all over the world. So excited to have you all joining us. Just to get to know you just a little bit better, I'd love for you to go ahead and complete this first poll on Slido and just let us know which group you're affiliated with. So we kind of get a sense of where you fit into your organization. I feel like we get a lot of others, so we probably are missing some categories. But if you put other, drop in the chat what your other is, and we'll get a sense of that. While we're on this slide and letting people fill it out, I'm actually going to have you guys introduce yourselves so everyone can get to know you, even though your pictures are on the next slide. So Jason, why don't you start and we'll go through real quick.
Absolutely. Great to be here. I am Jason Johnston. I'm the Executive Director of Online Learning and Course Production here at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. You see I'm wearing a little orange today, so go Vols. I have the privilege of helping to lead an amazing group of instructional design and media folk and other learning professionals focused on developing online learning here at the University of Tennessee. So that's me. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Thank you for being here. Andrew, why don't you say hello?
Hello. I'm Andrew Feldstein, Assistant Provost for Teaching Innovation and Learning Technologies at Fort Hays State University. I too have a team of instructional designers, instructional technologists, and faculty development specialists. One of our primary areas is online and engaging our online students with the learning process. We actually have domestically more of our students online than we do on our campus here in Western Kansas. And our mission is to make our online students feel virtually at home.
Wonderful. Thank you. And always a great introduction, Andrew. And John, why don't you introduce yourself as well? Thank you.
Sure. Hi, thanks for having me. I'm John Nash. I'm an associate professor in educational leadership studies at the University of Kentucky, and I'm also the director of the university's Laboratory on Design Thinking. And through our own dialogue here at our institution, I'm also on the transdisciplinary team at the provost level to help define and develop recommendations for responsible use of generative AI. So this topic today is really special.
Awesome. Well, and given the amazing backgrounds that the three of you had, I'm embarrassed to say that on our list of primary roles, we did not include either faculty or instructional designer, which we seem to have a lot of in the audience today. So that's awesome. And I apologize to the audience for not capturing that. But welcome you all, and welcome to the audience as well. So as I mentioned, I'm Katie Kapler. I am co-founder and CEO at Inscribe. I'll just do a quick, if you're not familiar with Inscribe, we are a virtual community platform that is designed to kind of combine the best of technology and AI with human connection to help students build strong relationships, find support when they need it, and really go after boosting that sense of belonging that is really important across all of higher education, but we particularly work with online and non-traditional students as well. So if you're interested in learning more about Inscribe, reach out to me. That is not the topic of our conversation today, so I will leave it at that. And let's get into the meat of our discussion. So before we get started, well, not before as we get started, a couple of definitions I wanted to bring out. I'm going to give this definition, but I want to welcome the panelists or anyone in the audience to add to it or amend it based on your experience. So which two topics we're talking about, AI and sense of belonging. First of all, I would say when it comes to artificial intelligence, lots of conversation about generative AI, where that fits in, how we're using that. But I think we all know that's not the only AI that's out there. And so I encourage the panelists and others to think more broadly about all the ways that AI is going to influence the conversation that we have today. And then I thought it would be helpful to just do a quick definition of sense of belonging, since it is something that a lot of people are talking about, but maybe haven't totally defined yet on your campus. And here's the definition I'm going to roll with. Again, feel free to amend. Sense of belonging is found when a student feels accepted, valued, included, and encouraged by the people around them and by their institution. So with that in mind, we have our second poll, which is to ask you, our audience, is sense of belonging something that you're thinking about on your campus? And if so, how would you describe that focus? And I'm actually going to toss that out as the first question to our panelists as well, just to get a sense of, I'm sure you're thinking about AI, but it'd be interesting to know at your institution, is sense of belonging or some variant of that something that you're talking about? So we'll start with John, since we'll go in the reverse order.
I think here at the University of Kentucky, we have initiatives underway to address this. And right from the top down, so at the president's office and even through his communications, we were concerned about everyone here feeling like they belong at UK. And so how that manifests itself is going to change across our units. But I get the feeling, Katie, that the emphasis is in line with the definition that you just offered.
Awesome. Great. Andrew?
Interesting topic. Our definition of belonging is actually morphing a little bit away from that to something more, practical. In our terms, we have recently done some work, surveys, and this one you're aware of, Katie, where we actually had, we included for our online students, we asked them a couple of questions. Some of them were the basic social belonging questions that many surveys tend to have. And we found that responses from our online students were in line with responses from our face-to-face students. And this actually was also in the NESE survey, where both our online and our face-to-face students said they felt they belonged. However, when we asked questions that were more related to how connected do you feel? Are you connected to your fellow students? Are you able to reach out to anyone if you need help? That number dipped significantly. And so one of the things that we are looking at is getting past the belonging piece into things that are more operationally defined in terms of how well they can, in fact, connect and interact with their instructors, with other students, and whatever help they need at the university. Because I think at the end of the day, we can convince people that they belong, but unless they can take action based upon that, it's sort of hollow.
Interesting. And I think that that's sort of reflected in the responses we're seeing here as well, which is we've thought about this and we're going the step further about what do we actually do to either support it or address it. What about you, Jason? Where are you guys at on this topic?
I think if sense of belonging was measured by being in a group of 105,000 of your closest friends, all wearing orange, cheering on football, it'd be very high. I think we're doing pretty good at various offices and in the school, helping with our in-student population or in-person student population. I think we have a lot of growth to be done for online because it's a different entity. They have different needs. We have an extended part of digital learning here at UT. We have people that are looking into really helping us understand who these students are and how do we foster it online. And that's kind of I think our instructional designers are there. We talk a lot about the community of practice and about presence within the online class. We design with this in mind all the time. I think some of our faculty that have been doing this for a little while are there. And I think we've got some room to grow, I would say, but we've got it in mind.
Yeah, well, and it's a great point, which is, and I should have said this also with my definition, what I'm often told is you can't just tell somebody they belong. That has to be a feeling that comes from within the student. So you might feel like you've done a million things to help them, but if they're not feeling it, it doesn't count. And how you foster that with a set of online learners or learners who may be commuting to school, not among 100,000 of their friends all wearing orange and cheering, it requires a different set of intentionality, I think, and maybe a different set of coordination across the institution, and perhaps could be fostered in some way by incorporating technology. So I think a lot of the conversation around AI has focused on some of the concerns and worries, especially, things like, I'm sure people here have all had the conversations around how students are using it and so forth. We're not so much going to dig into that today. And I'd actually love to start our conversation on a more positive note, which is how are you seeing the ability to incorporate, or how do you envision the ability to incorporate some of these tools as actually adding to that sense of belonging and facilitating peer connection? Does anyone want to jump in first, or should I assign it out? Andrew's not muted, so I'm going to give the ball to him first.
Gee, thanks. Early days. It really is. As you look at the possibilities, well, let me just put it this way. 6 months ago, when I was looking at the possibilities, I had a very different view than I have today. And as we see out in the industry, all the things that people are doing with generative AI in terms of the various large language models that are coming out, and potentially more interestingly, the huge number of companies that are taking those large language models and using them as engines behind their own graphic user interfaces to try to, for some purpose or another. I was looking at something today called Typing Mind, which basically it has built-in series of prompts in which you can, using one series, you can actually talk to a comedian or talk to a character in your favorite book, or and so the information has now been included within their interface so that AI takes on that persona. Sounds like a bit of a novelty thing at this point, but it's sort of, to me, I guess where we are in AI, we're still in that experimental stage. We're still in that what we can do. It's still, I've seen in many cases, it's sort of like the circus sideshow thing, where you'll say, look, I'm going to put this in and look what it does. And we have to actually get past that. And in terms of, if we want to think about complementing human interaction, which we are thinking about a lot, but it's going to take a lot more thinking in terms of how we get to that point where people are actually willing to meaningfully interact with the AI instead of treating it as output for, I've been referring to it recently as sort of like the magic 8-ball approach, where people just throw in questions and sort of laugh when they see the answer or that sort of thing.
Well, I think that, I mean, certainly the landscape is moving very quickly. And I think that's an interesting point that very experimental right now. People are starting to find tangible uses for it, especially in education. Certainly in the ed tech world, we see a lot of that happening. Jason, John, what would you add to that? Or from your own work, how are you incorporating it?
I think I'm starting to see it as complementing human interaction in its use as a tool to extend, and I've got air quotes here, human intelligence attributes. And so I think I've been thinking a lot more about the ways in which the generative AI is putting us as instructors in a not a difficult position, but an important position to really think about how our human intelligence attributes can be leveraged by the AI. So through creativity, through boosting imagination, by boosting critical thinking. And so, structurally, that could evidence itself as instructors using it as a supplemental teaching assistant, but being very thoughtful about how they prompt it, using it as a tutor to help make instruction more engaging and maybe conversational, attuned to the learner's needs. And then outside the classroom, I think it's again back on the shoulders of instructors to really think about what are the key ways in which I want AI to extend the most important human elements, and particularly belonging, to my learners. And I think that's where the AI can extend that sort of thinking. And so I'm really I see some promise there, but I'm also concerned because I think the professional development and the kind of capacity building we need to do now is less about why the models don't do what they should do, and rather what should the humans be doing with the models to extend the human intelligence capacities. Hope that made sense.
Yeah, I mean, no, well, and I know like when in some of our earlier meetings, we talked a lot about the human art of prompting with these AIs and how that in and of itself has become this creative exercise. Can you actually get the AI to give you the output you're looking for?
Yeah, and could I just add one thing to that? Because I've been thinking a lot about that in the last couple of days in the run-up to this conversation and just with others. If you looked at my sort of record on talking about this over the last 6 months, I was saying, prompt engineering, no big deal. That's going to manage its own affairs because the AI will sort of help us refine our prompts. No such thing has really happened. And I now believe that prompt engineering, I don't even like calling it that anymore, but I think thoughtful prompting is really important now, particularly if we want to have the outcomes that we're discussing on this webinar, because the prompts have to be complex and multi-layered and also tested by the instructors before they go out. And so it's really garbage in, garbage out. And I think that that's something that's worth talking about more at some point.
Yeah. Jason, what would you add into that?
Yeah, I would say on top of what John was talking about and Andrew is I'm seeing it more from the secondary effects. So how is AI helping the instructor to actually free up the human to do more of the human things? And, John and I, small podcast plug, onlinelearningpodcast.com. In the online learning podcast, we talked to Dr. Kristen DeCerbo, the Chief Learning Officer at Khan Academy a couple of weeks ago. But the conversation was around the fact that sometimes AI could actually help the instructor free up their time so that they can focus then on their human activities and indirectly then help some of that work out in a way that increases a sense of belonging because the student feels more seen. This could be examples like if it can help with taking some of the busy work of grading, or if it can help with some of those anytime during the day tutoring kind of situations, et cetera. So
Well, I think that's a great point, right? That AI is it's not necessarily a zero-sum game. Like it's either going to be AI or the human, and that if the AI can take on some of the work that humans don't need to do, that leaves humans to do the work that only really human, or we believe only humans can do, which a lot of it falls into this category. The other thing we've heard a little bit in our work too is that one of the aspects of belonging is just feeling like, you can be yourself and you can express yourself. And I think there are populations of learners who, for a variety of reasons, are kind of nervous about that in front of other human beings. And so there are times when interacting with technology, I don't know if it's always AI, but interacting with technology can be easier and can kind of smooth the pathway for those learners and help them feel like, all right, I've got my feet under me, I'm grounded, I know what I'm doing, without that pressure. So we see a little bit of that as well. But I think those are all great points. And I know we've talked a little bit in the past too, it's not one of the specific questions we have up here, but about whose role it is to really bring in sense of belonging. So I won't throw that out specifically, but thinking about that in general, because we've certainly talked about faculty and the role that they play in that, since they are such like the front line to students on a day-to-day basis. And how can we equip them to really do that in an effective way? But we started to touch on this, not to go super doom and gloom, but do you also foresee, like if implemented improperly or if taken too far, have you seen instances where the incorporation of this technology can kind of backfire or maybe move us steps backwards in some of the goals that we have in establishing these tools of connection and belonging? Andrew, you look eager to talk.
I'm eager to talk, yeah. And I've been, for the last couple of weeks, and I'm going to either blame or credit you, John, for taking me down a rabbit hole that I've spent potentially way more time than I ought to. But when we met to prepare for this webinar, John had one of these, oh, by the way, moments. There's somebody constructed something called a Hattie bot, which was designed, I think, in your words, to help to develop activities, course-based activities that wouldn't be, that AI couldn't complete. And so went down that rabbit hole head first, pretty much. And among the various outputs of this, I put the basic prompts in, and this is, I'll try to cut to the chase here because it's a long story. But basically there was a prompt that turned the bot, Claude in this case, into an instructional design bot that worked on basic principles from John Hattie in order to create learning experiences. So I went through that process. It blew my mind a bit because halfway through this process, I started to think differently about the conversation I was having with the AI, because what I was understanding was that without being prompted, just by telling Claude it was an instructional design bot that was an expert in John Hattie's visual learning protocols, it was. There was no input that anybody that I certainly put in, or that the accompanying PDF put in, that explained John Hattie. The bot just knew it because that information's out there. And it took me through a process of developing, which then took me to the next stage in my process, which was saying, I'm not, this John Hattie stuff is really interesting, but for the last 12 years, I've been working with Jan Harrington's authentic learning protocol. And so I switched it up and asked it to help me build a 8-week online asynchronous course, which I specified lots of things using that. And over a period of 2 days, I got the most beautiful course I've ever built. But that's not the point. Because the point is, seriously, because the point is, that is, if you look at that on the outside, on the surface, that's all very transactional. And a
Mhm.
lot of the conversations that I'm hearing around AI today are transactional conversations. I've asked it to do this, it did that. The student plagiarism issue is that it's also transactional. I asked it to do something and it did something. Students can ask it to take the prompt that you've given them to write an essay, and it will write an essay. But what I learned over that 2 days that I was really spending many, many hours building this was that one of the most meaningful ways to deal with generative AI is through a more transformational lens. And as we start looking at what I sort of learned during the process of building this was that with the proper framing, with the right prompts, we can go down a road that we were never able to go down before. Because it can take us, the feedback loop is so amazingly instantaneous in that if we have been struggling over our course learning outcomes, and I know many struggle over course learning outcomes, through very quick feedback loops, we can hone our objectives by saying, okay, this is what the objectives are, but I really want to do this, and we really want to do that. And you can have this whole conversation with the AI that you've already informed what its role is, and it will help you get where you're going as long as you think through what it is that you really need to do.
Mhm.
When we start looking at AI, if we're looking at it as transformational, we have these basic questions in mind, back to my magic 8-ball thing, and it answers those basic questions. But there's nothing there to then take it to the next step. But if we think very intentionally about what we're asking it and why, we're really having that conversation with ourselves. We are asking, instead of saying, what should my objectives for this course be? We need to say, my course needs to accomplish this and this and this. I want to do it in this very specific way. I want these types of outcomes. And then ask that question, then you're on the right path. But it is a
Right.
path.
Kind of, yeah.
And
It goes
involves-
back to that prompting
Yep.
sort of concept of like, you can't, yes, right. You have to, it almost forces you to be more creative because you have to think about where you're trying to get as your end game. John, you've been very active in the chat. You want to jump in and talk a little bit about, thank you for all that, by the way.
This the conversation reminds me of the conversation. We're at an inflection point, I think, now. 40 years ago, when microcomputers were entering educational spaces in P12, there was this notion that there was this well-intentioned throwing of computers at schools, and that if provided in sufficient quantity, quality would follow. And I feel like we're at the same point now with the generative AI that, oh, well, AI is here, it's artificially intelligent, and therefore I could just pretty much prompt whatever I need and it'll give me what I need. And that nothing could be really further from the truth, as Andrew's pointing out here. The HattyBot prompt is a 4-page PDF. It has eight or nine steps in it. It's very complex. And so to your question, are there ways in which the use of AI could get in the way of supporting peer connection and student sense of belonging? I think so, particularly if instructors fall into what I call the reductionist trap. And the reductionist trap is this risk of over-relying on AI tools in a way that simplistically reduces the complex human experiences that Andrew was describing, like belonging, empathy, wisdom, and getting it all down to just some data points or a prompt. And so I think that I would encourage all of us to start to think more carefully about the way we prompt these machines to give us the outcomes that we want.
Well, that's a great point. And I think we had a question earlier in the chat. Go back to see who posted it about like, what are we teaching our students along these lines as well, you know, to equip them to be prepared to utilize these tools in the future and to be experts in this space. And I think your point is well taken, which is you have to overemphasize some of these other qualities like creativity and, you know, design thinking and qualities that we've always wanted to instill in our students, but now are even more important because they are the qualities that are going to differentiate you in the workforce.
Yeah, and I'll just add, and sort of I mentioned in the chat, but I really appreciated Andrew's story of how he discovered it, went through a journey on this. The prompts like the HattyBot prompt and other ones that do this are the AI tools in the hands of an instructor who is creating non-AI activities for their learners that are rich and community building and hopefully creating belonging. So I just wanted to say that we don't have to have everything we do put AI in the hands of students. We can have it be a powerful tool for us to create great human interaction without the presence of AI in those learning activities.
Good point. Because one of the things that also struck me about Andrew's story was, and I have not built a course myself, so I don't, but that the interaction was only between Andrew and the technology. And you brought up, John, the concept of bringing computers into the classroom where the student is interacting with the technology. And does that mean that there are less opportunities or places where humans are coming together to solve these problems? Let's bring a team together to solve this. I don't need that team anymore because I'm just going to solve this with tech. Jason, did you want to jump in and add to this? Oh, Andrew, you want to add something?
Yeah, I was just going to say the other piece of that puzzle is that everything that, as I was doing that design work, front and center in terms of what I was asking is by framing that course as collaborative, by framing it and saying what opportunities can we build into this for student-to-student interaction? What can we build into this for instructor-student interaction? And so it was able to take these very complex things and say, here's 5 or 6 different ways that you might be able to incorporate, turn this into a learning community. And I would say, well, let's go down this path. And so at the end of the day, what was built was a very complex dance that I might not have been able to figure out on my own very quickly in terms of how to actually build that to be a course that supported peer-to-peer learning top to bottom.
Right. You use it to get to that end goal. That's really interesting. Jason, I know you were going to jump in here.
Yeah, and I have a couple of concerns kind of building off of these in terms of kind of a current and a future. One of my current concerns, just to bring up a big AI topic of conversation, is that students, I believe, partly have a sense of belonging because of trust within a classroom, trust between, and this is about as human as we can get, right? There's no trust really both ways involved when it comes to ChatGPT. And I think one of the ways that we can very quickly erode that trust is by falsely accusing students of using AI. And I just want to put it out there that as far as I'm concerned, to this point, I keep hearing people that will swear by some AI detector, this and that or the other. And every time I go in with an open mind and I test them out, and there are no AI detectors that work reliably right now. And I'm afraid that AI is, because of our fear of AI, that for teachers this fall, it's getting in the way of our trust of our students. And I think that we're eroding then for some of those students a real sense of belonging inside of that classroom. I don't know what all the answers are to that. I have some suggestions maybe, but we don't need to get into all the solutions. But I think that is a real concern for me currently. My future concern has more about how these things are going to scale, and what happens when we have the Hattie bot, but it's not just the Hattie bot, it's a menu of Hattie bots and various things that can chain AI to create everything we can possibly conceive of, Andrew, in terms of our classes, and to teach the classes for us as well, and so on. And when it comes to that, I think that AI getting in the way of a sense of belonging, I do think that students will and need to continue to feel a sense of teacher presence and belonging inside of the classroom. And I don't want any administrators to get any funny ideas in their heads that teachers could ever be replaced, or instructional designers or teachers themselves, to think, oh, great, I can just put this on autopilot. I think most teachers aren't really there, but I think that is my future concern. So I kind of have a present maybe I have a lot of concerns, but I have a present concern and a future concern, at least one of each.
Well, I'm so glad you brought that up. I think trust is, I would add that to that definition of belonging that I gave earlier, because I totally agree with that. And I think a lot of people, if you reflect back on your school days, I don't know how much of what you learned in the class is the first thing that comes back to you versus the people that you met, the relationships that you built, the people
Right.
who influenced you, and how important that component was. So
Right.
I couldn't agree with you more. But I think there is we see every time I turn around, there's another tutor bot, coming to the forefront. So I'll be curious to see how that evolves as well. You started to touch on something else as well, which kind of gets us into we had this before we get into our next question. So just to refresh everybody in the audience, get you active again, throw out, now that we've talked a little bit about some of the pros and cons of how we are seeing AI being incorporated into education. If you get on your Slido, just put in a couple of words that come to your mind when you think about how these things might intersect. And I don't know if you guys have words yourself that pop into your mind when you think about this. I love watching as they come in. And I like the idea of generating ideas and the way that was phrased, because I think it's a little bit of what we talked about. It's not always the solution. It's generating possibilities that humans can then work upon and act upon. Any thoughts from the panels on things that you see happening in here? Support for writer's block. Amen. I take that one all day.
I think one of the things
Creativity.
that I was listening to what Jason was saying, and I think the trust piece is extremely, it's an essential piece, and as we sort of take this from the belonging end as opposed to from the AI end for a minute, there are two. We're looking at two terms. I don't see the other one up here yet, but the other one is risk. And when we think about belonging and we think about students, particularly our online student population, reaching out to their instructors, reaching out to other students, it's risk and trust that keep them from doing that. And so, they don't know the other students as they would a student who is sitting in the classroom next to them, and they're not going to turn to them and say, "What in the world just happened today?"
Right.
So there's that whole barrier. So I guess a question that I would bring up at this point is, how could AI somehow help us bridge that gap, help us get to the point where we can connect with one another in a way that the AI helps facilitate as opposed to obviate?
Yeah. And I'm obviously a big believer in that as well. I think so we can talk about that in a little bit in the next question too, Andrew, which just to close out what's happening here, I think it also echoes what you were just saying, which is, what did you say? Risk and what was your other one?
Trust.
Trust, right. So sort of not necessarily opposites, but sort of a little bit opposite ends of the spectrum, which is a lot of what we see happening here. Half the words are very positive. Half the words are, I think, a lot drawn by uncertainty and risk. So I think that frames up kind of where we are all thinking about AI. It also leads into our next question, which Jason started to touch on, which is a little bit more about the ethics of all of this. Ethical considerations in AI is a wide bucket. And we had a question actually come into the Q&A asking specifically about this topic, and in this case about equitable access and how that might create further differentiation and inequity across the landscape. Curious how you guys are thinking about it, whether you see that manifesting at all at your institution or at other folks, with other places that you've been talking to. Jason, you want to jump in first this time?
Sure. And I think, Raza, that's a great question. And if you aren't seeing that question, I don't know, does everybody see the question that they raised?
They should be able to, but you know what? Let's put it in the chat anyways. I'll just copy it over there.
Sure.
Okay.
Because
sure if Q&A is just private to us.
I think it raises some really great questions that I'm not sure I am certainly able to answer, but I think simply by raising the question about inequalities when it comes to, again, another, we've been talking about the digital gap for years, right? The equity gap when it comes to digital access, and it's only going to become more prominent again. Internet was the last thing, right? And we're trying to shorten that gap, but it's only going to become more prominent again. And I think partly by raising the questions when our instructors, as they decide on tools and decide on what they're asking students to use, and also having some transparency perhaps in the tools that they're using and what's expected, as well as having universities that perhaps buy into specific tools and they start thinking about it in terms of access of, for instance, it's not the way it always works here, but our ideal whenever we add a new tech tool at University of Tennessee, that it's just baked in, that students don't have to make a choice of if they're going to buy their book or buy gas for the car, you know. So we just bake it into everything so that we can provide the same access of a tool to everyone. And I think as we get into that, I think that could solve at least some of that problem, to kind of line up with the tech tools that are freely available to students or provided through the institutions.
No, thank you for that. And I also am really glad you brought up that topic of transparency, because I do think one of the other things we hear about is, what was the model trained on? How does that influence the answers and the output that it's providing? And there was an article in the New York Times, I don't know if it specifically came out today, but where they're starting to try to grade these AI systems based largely on how transparent they are across the whole spectrum of topics. And it was really interesting for me to see, first of all, how many there are out there, but then also how they're falling into this sort of grading rubric, if you will. So I think that's early days on that conversation. We've got a lot of work to do to even understand what transparency means, but I'm happy to see that people are starting to think and talk about it. Andrew or John, do you guys have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, go ahead, Andrew.
Yeah, well, and not to get too philosophical here, but as we look at ethical considerations, if we are in a way, there's looking at an artificial intelligence that is taking on many human traits. And so basically any ethical considerations we would consider as humans, we need to consider here as well, in terms of behaviors, in terms of what's appropriate or not in given situations. And I'm not sure how this all shakes out, but potentially, given the breadth of this whole thing, the considerations that need to apply are going to be also extremely broad.
Yes, and to go back to that, so I sometimes phrase this question when I'm talking to other people about more specifically around what are the ethical considerations of AI pretending to be human, and do we have an obligation to tell people that when it's the case? And I mean, I think that's a whole conversation in and of itself, but when we go back to that idea of trust and how easily you could violate that trust by hiding that element, that really creates like sort of a visceral reaction for me. I see you nodding, John.
I'm just thinking of a comment I heard from a colleague of mine here at the University of Kentucky who's in computer science and is much closer to the center of the ways in which these models are created. And his comment to our group was that these companies are, quote, notoriously secretive, unquote, with regard to how they build these things. And so I think this is an important thing. And it also goes to the point or the story that came out, I think, yesterday in the New York Times about Anthropic's move to have a 1,000 common people weigh in on their constitution and what should the model do. So I also depressed me by saying almost in the same breath, and we don't plan to really make that part of our model soon, but they're at least having the conversation to say, we have a constitutional model, we think that it ought to be more ethical, and now we're even going to ask real people also how it should go. I think their early tests suggested that it was slightly less biased than their original model, and so I think there's hope. We just have to have these companies do that. To the question of the ethical considerations, I think that there's two things on my mind, and that it's sort of, there's the ethics punch list, and then there's the strategic sort of through line to complete the punch list, because we can talk all day about that list of student privacy, bias prevention, what's the impact on transparency, things like that. But I think then once we decide these things should be honored, what is the human through line to accomplish the punch list? And so it goes back to our comments about prompt engineering. I mean, there's a need for human judgment in the prompt engineering that relates to ethics of transparency and oversight. I mean, these responsibly designed systems have to have more visible ways of saying how they achieve things, and instructors should be transparent about the prompts they use. And so, because if we over rely on the AI tools, then that ties us back into concerns around whether we are blocking out certain populations or we're being too simplistic about the way in which we think about our students. And so I think it's a twofold thing.
Yeah, well, and I love, to your point too, once you know what the ethics are, how are we incorporating them into how we're using AI, and how are we enforcing it? Like, how are we testing the AI to make sure that it's living up to these ethical goals that we want to set for it? And you kind of hope that eventually there'll be enough pressure from the folks using the tools to say that the ones that have that transparency or provide those things that will rise to the top. I don't know that that always is the case in our society, but we can continue to hope that that is the direction.
Yeah, can I give one example to that?
Yeah, please do.
I was thinking about the one other thing on ethical is certainly copyright, which is not just an issue for just trying to toe the copyright line, but also in teaching our students what copyright is, as well as scholarly works and so on. And my hope is that there are some tools out there that actually are, for instance, in the image creation part of AI. There are a couple of tools that are trying to be more conscious of copyright now. So Adobe Firefly, they just released a whole bunch of new AI kind of tools and what they're doing, and they have ethical considerations. If you ask it to make something copyrighted, it won't do it for you. The downside, and you talked about, my hope is that people will move towards these more copyrighted things. The downside is that it doesn't quite do as good of a job as other ones that, like Midjourney, which is just kind of doors wide open still, Yeah. And so I hope that our votes will speak in the end. And as we take our vote away from some that are, by us being unwilling to give them our vote, we give it to others, then our votes will speak, and to be able to go and help support and move forward those organizations, technology companies that have ethical considerations as a big part of what they're doing.
I hope so too, Jason. I know humans like to talk about the value of guardrails, but don't always like them when they're implemented. So I hope so too. But thank you for that example. And I think it would be, to sort of round out the conversation today, we saw that a lot of people are thinking about belonging. I'm sure everybody is thinking about AI. Considering your organizations and how you've started to incorporate AI, what advice would you have for the folks on the call as they think about how to bring that into their practice and their work, and to do it in a way that will be successful? John, lead us off.
I'm going to here I am railing against reductionism, then I may make a very reductionist statement. But I see a wide range of capacity amongst, at least in the higher ed space, of instructors and faculty to embrace or understand the ways in which this might be leveraged for good. And it really runs the gamut. And so, I found that over time, really starting with foundational education on how generative AI works, I think this is crucial as institutions start to implement it across their campus. And so just, I think, and maybe we can come back. I'll just start with one thing. Let's explain how large language models simply work, and that their responses are based on training data, not original thought. And then the second thing I guess I would say, if I could add one more thing, is I was really endeared by, we had the Commonwealth Computational Summit was here this week, and I went to a session in the afternoon of lightning rounds by faculty from in our region who are using generative AI in their classes. And there's a lot of really special stuff going on that's thinking through the ways in which it can be used with students to generate their own work, and then what they might do to sort of parry opportunities for cheating. And so I think also just search out those that are doing interesting things and use them as examples as a launch point for your own work if you're thinking about this.
That's great advice. Start with the basics. Let's all understand what we're working with here, which sounds very simple, but I think a lot of people have skipped over that step completely.
They have.
And then be willing to learn from others. And if you do something really interesting and cool, be willing to share it. I think this is a great opportunity for collaboration across organizations, as you point out, John. Jason, what are you going to say? What advice are you going to give us?
I would say first, if your institution has not already done this, is to think about getting some people in a room to try to develop some guidelines. We can be, institutions of higher learning can be leaders in this by, even if the individual tech companies haven't caught up yet, by creating our own guidelines and creating our own constitutional model about how we desire for AI to work. And I had the privilege of being part of one of the committees here at UT, Philosophy Committee, where we talked about our basic principles, one of them being, more of a human, that we want to be human-centered as we apply any AI, and we want to be open and transparent, all these kind of things, and getting different people in the room to be able to talk about that. I don't think policy will do everything for you, but I think that statements policy and then translate it into something that people can understand and see and read and hear may actually help people also think about it and move forward and get on the same page with it. Second, I would say the other kind of person we're missing, although John is actually a professor as well. He's not just an administrator and a fine podcaster. But so we do have a professor in our midst. However, we are missing a student here today. Nobody's fault or anything like that. Yeah. But I think that I find I'm having a lot of these conversations, wonderful conversations with lots of other really smart people in higher ed, having great conversations of what to do. But some of the more valuable experiences I've had is getting students into the room to hear what they're hearing about, or what they're hearing, what they're thinking, what they're talking about. And I think that not only will help us implement AI in a way that will promote their success, actually, even by doing that, we will promote their success and belonging. By hearing what they have to say, we're not just throwing all these things out there in a vacuum, telling the students what they should be thinking and how they're acting and so on. So I think the more that we can do that, particularly, I think it makes sense here that we're academics coming together in this forum. But I think particularly as we're doing this at our institutions, I think as much as we can get some student voices in the mix, I think we'll all be richer for it.
That is an excellent point. And we've seen that in other projects that we've worked on, that when you bring students into the conversation, they feel a sense of ownership, and they're much more likely to participate in not just the conversation, but the outcome of that conversation. So that's a great point, Jason. Andrew, pop us off here.
Yeah, I don't know that I have advice other than to say, and this goes back to John's point about understanding what it is what's happening here. What, if before we can start talking about how to use AI to embrace belonging, we need to understand how it's going to be used. One of the things we don't know is exactly why it does what it does, which is scary. But if we, I mean, it's sort of early days. We're in the midst of like this maelstrom, and things are swirling around to the point, and it's hard to sort of say, okay, let's stop for a minute and figure out what this is or what it does, because it's not stopping at this point. And however humans over whatever the next period of time is decide they want to try to interact with this, it's all going to be experimental at this juncture. And some of it's going to work and some of it's not going to work, and some of it's going to come up with pretty bad results and some of it's going to come up with good results. I guess the only advice that I would give in terms of the relationship between AI, student belonging, and success is be very careful.
Be careful, but also be open, right? And I take your point too, Andrew, which is as the landscape is changing, the conversation that you're going to have at your institution is not a point in time and then you're done, right? It has to be kind of an ongoing assessment of how the landscape is changing and how you might want to adjust your policies or have you been implemented it as things evolve. Well, this has been an amazing conversation. I really want to thank our participants. Oh, I did want to share one thing really quick. So first of all, John or Jason, you should put a plug for your podcast into the chat. If you have a link to that, please drop it in there. Also, if anybody is interested, Andrew and his team at Fort Hays State University put together a really great case study about the community building that they have done at their institution, specifically about how to use technology to drive better peer connection and sense of belonging. So you can scan that. I think Danielle will also drop a link into someone will drop a link into the chat for us. But moreover, I just want to thank our panelists for being here. This is just such a complicated topic. So I think I love how we can talk big picture, but you guys also have really practical examples and solutions that people can adopt and bring into their own practice. So thank you guys for being here. Love having you.